All right, so I was trying to record a response to this in my car, but it didn't exactly go very smoothly, partially because there was a police checkpoint at one point, and then at a different point, at a different time, my dad called me. So there was a debate earlier today. It's been removed by either by YouTube or by the user who is Israel Advocacy Movement concerning whether Zionists should support the white ethno-state or something. So the main focal point was Mark Collett, who is, of course, a pretty staunch member of the far right. And I would say that, unfortunately, the debate could have probably been a lot more clear if there wasn't this one guy who was participating named Rafi Bloom, who was on the other side, who is an Israel advocate, and who pretty much lost his shit and started to say, well, everything he's saying is anti-Semitism, meaning Mark Collett, so therefore I'm going to have a temper tantrum and leave. So that was a pretty ridiculous moment, and I think that he essentially gave the people who were watching, most of whom were members of Collett's camp, the far right camp, he gave them exactly what they were looking for, a scene of an Israel advocate and a Jew who pretty much lost his cool and left because of anti-Semitism. You're not going to, the debate was not about anti-Semitism, and you're not going to convince people who hate you to suddenly look at you as somebody normal, especially not by doing that. But the real topic was exactly what the title was, whether you should support a white ethno-state. So I'll go through the positions of some of these people and what they really why I think it was a very good debate to have, and also my position on this whole topic. So you had Joseph Cohn, who's a pretty liberal but pro-Israel Zionist British person, British Jew. You also had Rafi Bloom, same idea, almost the same type of opinions. And then you had a couple other people, Brian of London and Judas Maccabeus, who were pretty far-right Jewish Zionist advocates. And then there was there's another guy whose name I couldn't remember, who was an Indian English guy who was pretty far-right, ethno-nationalist, and supports Mark Collett's point of view about a white ethno-state. And then you have Mark Collett himself, which is the person we set up the topic with this in mind, that he was trying to say, well, look, in his mind, his view is that Israel has accomplished this idea of the ethno-state, whereas the white people, specifically in his case British white people, but he also means white people in general, they are in danger, and the miscegenation and issues of so cultural Marxism, they are eroding the idea of a real white society, and he is pushing back against it, and he wants their support in order to create such an ethno-state. So the people who opposed it obviously were Bloom and Cohn, and then the other two, Maccabeus and Brian of London, were saying, well, look, I mean, we would be perfectly willing to support it. But there were some hang-ups that really, I thought, Mark Collett showed that implied that he really doesn't know exactly how to convince people to support him. People who are, on the opposite side who happen to be Jewish, which I would assume was one of the goals of his coming on the show. Obviously, another goal was to show that he is capable of debating people who are against him, which I think he did. I don't think he did a horrible job, but there were a number of pieces of evidence, and I can't show them to you because the video was taken down by YouTube, probably for obvious reasons, because people didn't want this debate to happen. It's a debate that should have happened, but the issues that I saw with Mark Collett's argument were, his obsession with things like Jewish presence within the media and the porn industry and governments and whatever, and conflating that with Zionism. And when I was trying to record this earlier, which didn't really work, I went really into far depth with it. But the bottom line is, if you look at people like Sarah Silverman and Natalie Portman, people who are liberal Jews, Billy Joel, none of them are really staunch Zionists. In some cases, they're willing to appear in Israel. In other cases, they're part of the BDS movement. And the main thrust of progressive Jewish thought nowadays is moving against supporting Zionism, more towards anti-Zionism, which is a topic that we've addressed a couple times on this channel. And the idea that this pervasive left-wing stance within society is allied with Zionism is pretty ridiculous. It would be like saying that he's allied with, because after all, he's coming out and saying, well, I support an ethno-state too, and you guys are an ethno-state. So does that mean he's supporting Zionism now? I don't know. I think it's pretty ridiculous to say either of those things. The fact is that there's a lot of left-wing Jews who do hold views that are pretty ridiculous, including the white privilege idea, which he brought up with Tim Wise. And there were a series of, actually he had a whole poster board or graphic with tons of tweets that were of Jews who said things that were incredibly derogatory about white people on Twitter. But in the cases that he specifically dealt with, using, for example, Tim Wise, using Haaretz magazine, those are all either anti-Zionists in the case of Tim Wise or post-Zionists in the case of Haaretz. And this coming from me, I don't really define myself as a Zionist. I'm really, I don't think it's a real political philosophy anymore. I think it's kind of devolved into, some people call themselves a compassionate conservative. It's a meaningless title now because it means everything and nothing at the same time. That's what Zionism is. But an anti-Zionist is a person who has goals and vision and opinions that are contrary to those of creating a Jewish state. That's what Tim Wise would be, and I've checked on it. And if you look at the Haaretz newspaper, they would be what you call post-Zionists, which means that they, in many cases, are trying to refute the very notions of Zionism and essentially call for a state that's the opposite of an ethno-state in Israel. They want what's called a state of all its citizens over there, which would mean that there would be a right of return for the Palestinians. It means that there would be, in essence, the removal of the Jewish identity of Israel. That's what Haaretz newspaper is about. And if you want to look up a little bit more about that, you can Google the name Amos Schocken. Amos, A-M-O-S, Schocken, S-C-H-O-C-K-E-N. He was the publisher of Haaretz, and those were his opinions. And most of the people who write for his newspaper, including Gideon Levy, would be consistent with that opinion. And they are probably the worst example to bring up in a debate about Zionism and ethno-states or whatever, because they're against it. They're against both a Zionist ethno-state and a white ethno-state, whatever those would be in any shape or form. So I think that it was very, and Brian of London kept bringing up that it was a bad comparison to make, but he didn't really state why. The reason why, which he was getting at, was that Haaretz would be akin to the Independent or Metro over in Britain, or the Mirror. An organization. The Haaretz is basically almost an anti-Zionist publication. There are much more egregiously anti-Zionist publications over there, like Plus 972, which is, I think, only in English. But there is, there's this notion that these left-wing Zionists, once they, or left-wing Jews, I would say, left-wing progressive Jews, once they leave their country of origin, let's say they come from, I don't know, Germany or whatever, and they fly over to Israel. In the minds of people like Collett, they think there's suddenly a switch that goes off, or maybe they're consciously making the decision that they go from being a burning, flamboyant socialist into being a nationalist. And it just doesn't happen that way. If you look at some of these NGOs that are in Israel, which was brought up by Judas Maccabeus, who was one of the people who was in the panel, those NGOs, the New Israel Fund, the B'Tselem organization, Adala, which is not necessarily Jewish, but I think there are Jews that participate in it. Those groups the Mahsom Watch, the Checkpoint Watch, which I personally had encounters with them. They are as vehemently anti-nationalist as any other group that would, Antifa, whoever is opposing Mark Collett, they have the same exact thing over there in Israel. Anarchists Against the Wall was a big group when I lived there. Another big point that was driven across was that you can't call a country an ethno-state when 20% or more of its residents are not part of the so-called ethnic majority that is being used as the example of the group that is making up the ethno-state, which in Israel's case, there's upwards of 20% of the residents are not Jewish at all. They would be Arab. There's also an unknown quantity of the population that is from Ukraine or other countries in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, that would be, they are what I would call, they've immigrated, they have Jewish relatives, they might have some Jewish ancestry, but in fact, by law over there, they're not considered Jewish, and in fact, there are marriage issues over there in terms of marriages between Jews and non-Jews over there. So those are things that you have to take into account, and they complicate this idea of the ethno-state, because those people who came in who are sort of borderline, they're not, according to Jewish law, the halacha, they would not be considered Jewish, yet the Israeli government allowed them to come into the country. That actually refutes the idea of the ethno-state. And some of these people are from Russia. Some of these people also happen to be from Ethiopia. Some of the Ethiopians happen to have converted to Judaism. Some of the Russians happen to have converted into Judaism. So that's not an ethnicity. And that's the biggest point that was missed, or maybe just touched upon very briefly. That Judaism is in fact a religion, that you can't classify the Jews as an ethnicity of one type or another. For example, that this is why, getting to my opinion, I can't be considered, I would not support an idea of an ethno-state, but that we'll get to that in a second. Because, for example, my ancestry is Ukrainian and Iraqi. That's not one ethnicity, that's two ethnicities, but they're both Jewish. You could look at countries you could look at countries where Jews come from. For example, the last officer that I had in the army, my second lieutenant, first lieutenant, whatever, she was Indian. Her family came from India. So by ethnicity, she was 100% Indian. My captain for most of my service was 100% Moroccan. And to claim that both of those are the same ethnicity is so ridiculous that you'd have to be deliberately trying to lie, or be just so clouded by your own personal belief system and cognitive dissonance in order to really believe that. I mean, it's the same issue. What if I was to say to Mark Collett, well, look, you could have a person who is Moroccan and they convert to the Church of England and they want to move to England. Why shouldn't you let them come? They live in Morocco and they convert to Anglicanism. Why can't they come to England? And I'm pretty sure that he would, either he would be forced to say that yes, it's an exception, or he would say, well, the Anglican religion doesn't really make you English. There are millions of Anglicans who are Nigerian, by the way, and I doubt that Mark Collett is really thinking about them when he says, oh, this is the idea of the British ethno-state. It's plainly wrong, because he says he's talking about white people. So the two things are apples to oranges. The Jewish so-called ethno-state is not an ethno-state on the model that Mark Collett is talking about, because you're talking about just two different. It's just, in one case you have a religious group that does have ethnic tendencies to it, because of course there are languages that are identified with the Jews. For example, the Hebrew language, Yiddish. There's also the Ladino language. There's Jewish Persian. There's Jewish Arabic. But none of those are, if you speak any of those languages, let's say for whatever reason you were, an Austrian, and you were to learn Yiddish or whatever, that does not make you Jewish. Just as if I was to learn Korean, and the head of my team over at work, who happens to be Korean, I could speak to him in Korean. That does not make me Korean. Okay? and being immersed in Korean culture and knowing a lot of Korean references and things like that, yes, that would make me a bit acculturated to being Korean, but I'd still be a Ukrainian and an Iraqi. Okay, the same idea if I was to learn Ukrainian and all of that. I have a lot of people around here who are Ukrainian. Some good friends of mine are Ukrainian. I could learn those things. It still would not make me an ethnic Ukrainian. I'd still be half Iraqi or whatever, right? That's really what Mark Collett is talking about. He's not talking about culture and traditions and things like that. He is literally talking about racial characteristics, which is something that he doesn't want to admit. There were some points where I think he did hammer in where he was saying, look, we're actually not for violence, and we want to basically ensure the future of our own people. You know, they started talking about the 14 words and stuff like that. That whole thing, I think he wants to be two things at the same time without being able to reconcile them. He wants to be able to show himself to be a free speech believer, while at the same time not looking at the responses people are giving him and respecting the validity of their speech. Most of the people who were on the panel said they have no problem with white people. I think none of them said that they had a problem with white people. A couple of them said that they were sympathetic to the idea of a white ethno-state. So what's his problem with them? He just kept citing over and over again these media figures and these porno kings and whatever. Which, by the way, what the hell do you care? You know, the porn and the Hollywood or whatever. You don't have to watch it. You can certainly critique it just like I can. But the fact is that there is this issue with these alt-right people that they just seem to believe that they have this victim status, just like a lot. By the way, the other guy, Rafi Bloom, on the panel had a victim mentality too, and that's why he lost his shit and left the show. Okay, that's the whole problem, that you have people who project on the target audience. Okay. Whether, you're talking about Mark Collett talking to the Jews, or you're talking, and they say, look, you're Jewish and you believe like this because I know a lot of other people think like that, and therefore you are responsible for it. That's not true. People like me, people who are individualists, they'll reject that. Just because some black people believe in, for example, the Nation of Islam and Louis Farrakhan, that doesn't mean that I think that all the black people in America believe in that. And in fact, Mark Collett was just, he would have to, if he was applying the same standards, he would have to say, well, look, yeah, a lot of the white people actually are racist, which they're not. Okay, if you're trying to project this on to the Jewish people, which he is, then it basically is the same standard that these social justice warriors, including a lot of the Jews that he was citing, are applying to white people. These people are all enemies of individual rights and personal freedoms. Whether you're talking about the far right people, the far right ethno-nationalists like Mark Collett, granted he has the right to free speech, and I think it's ridiculous that they take this video down. Whether you're talking about people like the liberal people like Rafi Bloom, who's not really liberal because he loses his shit because look, you are expecting anti-Semitism, therefore you shouldn't lose your temper when you hear it. Okay, that's one thing. And then when you talk about people on the far left, they're for sure the enemies of personal freedom. So if you have all these people who are constantly angry and attacking other people and criticizing them just for having ideas and just for thinking things, and you're looking at them as a whole collective based on their ethnicity or their religion or whatever, then that means you are an enemy of the individual and of personal freedom. That's about it. Please like, share, and subscribe. Also subscribe to me on Gab at Starscream85, on Parler at Razor Ray, also on Minds.com, BitChute, and if you want to donate on Subscribestar, those are all at Chef Leopard, and I'll talk to you later.